There's been a lot in the news this last week about fairness between generations and who pays for what in the context of social care. And we've seen the disagreements that that's caused. Today, we want to explore issues of intergenerational fairness in terms of climate change. We all know that just like in our everyday lives, policymakers can often put off difficult decisions, particularly if there's a big price tag. This can lead problems and costs to stack up for the future, as in the social care debate. But climate change raises many of the same issues, but on a wholly different level. Climate change is happening now. Just in the last few months, we've seen how climate impacts are already causing devastation, not just in island nations, but in London and New York. And not just for people, but also for nature in terms of biodiversity. And when it comes to the climate, delaying decisions can lead to a reduction in choices and options. Vitally, putting the hard calls off may lead to potentially catastrophic climate tipping points from which we might not be able to return. When thinking about climate change, therefore, the past is not necessarily a good guide to the future. The counterfactual, as the economists say, is not the same as the world as it is now. In this roundtable, we'll be asking what a framework for assessing the intergenerational effects of decarbonisation and climate adaptation might look like. And crucially, given the need for action at scale and pace, what needs to happen for long-term interests to be properly considered by policymakers. This raises big questions of who pays for what. Today, we'll be focusing on UK action, given our need, particularly this year with COP, to show national leadership, whilst recognising that these issues also have a global significance and require an international response. I'm Sharon Darcy, the Director of Sustainability First. For those of you that don't know us, we're a think tank and a charity that develops practical proposals that promote environmental, social and economic well-being, with a particular focus in public utilities like energy, water and communications. Climate change and climate impacts don't affect everyone equally, not only in terms of socio-demographics, but also in terms of places and over time. To try and build a better picture of the distributional impacts of these issues, last year we published a meta-analysis of research on the social impacts of decarbonisation and adaptation in the UK. This identified gaps in understanding of both the regional and intergenerational impacts of climate change. Our work and this roundtable are seeking to address one of those gaps. We've got some great speakers today. In part one, we'll start by hearing from Matthew Bell and Amar Malik from Frontier Economics on their excellent report for us on this topic. We're really grateful to Frontier and the Frontier team for carrying out this analysis for us pro bono. My colleague Martin Hurst will then chair a Q&A with participants on the report, picking up key points for clarification. We'll then have a response to the report from Peter Davies. Peter played a lead role in the development of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act and was previously chair of the Climate Change Commission for Wales. In part two, Sustainability First Associate Maxine Ferg will then share some of Sustainability First's recommendations in this area and will chair a panel discussion of some of these and what actions are needed in this area. Our excellent panel is made up of Paul Johnson from the Committee on Climate Change and the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Bridget Rosewell from the National Infrastructure Commission, Maureen Paul from Ofgem, and Sustainability First Martin Hurst. After a discussion with the panel and questions from the audience, we'll end with some reflections from Frontier and thoughts on next steps from us. This event, including the questions, will be recorded and put on our YouTube and website. To ask a question, please raise your hand. It's under the reactions button at the bottom of the screen. Unless you're asking a question, we'd ask that you please keep yourself muted and keep your camera off. So let's kick off on what is going to be a really timely and important discussion. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and very pleased to be here, and good to, well, not quite see everybody, but hope to have you there participating in the virtual world. I should say at the outset, this has been very much a joint effort, and thank you very much to Sustainability First for all of their input, thoughts, and guidance as we've gone along trying to pull this document together. In a way, I guess what we're trying to do is to combine two worlds that often don't come together. The first of those is the increasing focus on a just transition. And within that, there are lots of issues, issues around affordability, issues around inclusion, lots of issues around geography, different impacts across different geographies. But a lot of that is focused very much on the current generation, and the time period out to 2050, when lots of the net zero targets converge. And we're trying to combine that discussion around what a just transition looks like with the very technical world, often very technical world, of cost-benefit analysis in government, and how you go about doing cost-benefit analysis of policies and of investments that take place over long periods of time. As one illustration of how those are coming together, just last week, in fact, the government published its new carbon values, an updated set of carbon values compared to the ones that existed before. And they start at around £240 per tonne of CO2 in 2020 and go up to about £380 per tonne of CO2 in 2050. Indeed, in the uncertainty range, on the top end of that range, up to nearly £600 per tonne in 2050. And the first thing to note about that is they're quite high. They're certainly higher than the previous values that existed. But the second thing to note is that the values end in 2050. And they end, there's an explanation for why they end, because of lots of uncertainty post 2050. But effectively, that's one generation from where we are now. And so how do we think about the intergenerational impacts and the longer term impacts of climate action and of climate change? Trying to bring together those two worlds, this sort of technical analysis world and the broader just transition world, in the form of a single document. And what issues does that raise? And that's what we've tried to set out in this document, is a sort of checklist, a starting point for a framework to think about a proper framework for how to undertake analysis and discuss these issues in a robust way. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Amar, to describe that framework, and then we'll continue with more discussion. Amar.
Thank you very much, Matthew. As mentioned, I'm pleased to run through some of the key elements of the initial framework that we here at Frontier, in collaboration with Sustainability First, have put together. I'll then spend a bit of time moving on to some of the emerging lessons that have come about as a result of our exercise of putting this initial framework together, as there were a number of sort of very salient points of note for policymakers to potentially bear in mind through our work. But before, I think, moving on to the framework itself, a quick note perhaps on our initial approach to devising the framework. We ended up opting for a public policy tool known as a logic model approach, which considers the chains of causal links between policies and their long-term effects on the world. And this was designed in order to account for some of the unique features of climate change policy. We noted that with climate change, and uniquely relative to other public policy measures, the future is manifestly likely to be worse off in the future than it is for current generations. And this required us to spend time thinking more from first principles around how we might create a newer approach in order to account for some of these unique features when considering climate change policies' intergenerational effects. I'm now going to share my screen, so hopefully this is all coming through, and move on to the framework itself. As you can see from the framework, for considering the intergenerational effects of decarbonisation and climate adaptation policies, it's likely that policymakers will need to consider a range of inputs outputs, and outcomes alongside their associated effects on future generations. However, we recognise that prior to this consideration, there's also an importance on recognising and considering the ethical assumptions that lie behind particular policies. This might include policymakers considering questions such as how far they ought to take the welfare of future generations into account, or the extent to which policymakers even indeed have a responsibility towards nature. We noted that these questions will inevitably be more subjective than other elements of our framework, with appropriate weight varying depending on particular policymakers, or alternatively depending on citizen engagement. However, we did find that in much of the literature, there is importantly an obligation to future generations as well as to nature. And the consideration of these ethical dimensions is elaborated upon further in our report and its annex, which expands upon how policymakers can consider a range of the more salient ethical questions associated with intergenerational policy considerations. I think the next aspect of our framework recognises that policymakers ought to consider the economic inputs of their policies. Now, these inputs refer broadly to the resources that go into particular policies, and involves considering the intergenerational effects of technology investments, for example, the range of regulations that lie behind particular projects and policies, how the project might be financed, for example, for example, kind of the taxation measures that lie behind particular policies, and also discount rates, which are used to determine how much today's society should invest in limiting future climate change impacts. Beyond these inputs, however, we recognise that policymakers ought to consider the outputs of their policies when determining their intergenerational effects. And these outputs broadly refer to the results of a particular policy. It might involve, for example, considering the intergenerational effects via policy impacts on employment or economic growth, or alternatively on technological progress. As recognised in our report, we noted that there will be a number of shifts in employment as a result of decarbonisation and climate adaptation measures, with workers being likely to move from brown sectors rather towards green sectors. And policymakers ought to kind of recognise this shift in employment and sort of act accordingly in light of that with regard to broader reskilling measures alongside other policies there too. But I think linked to these outputs also lies a consideration for policy outcomes. And these outcomes refer to the longer term effects of policies as a result of particular outputs, broadly referring to the state of the world that policies bring about. A consideration of policy outcomes would likely involve considering the impact of policies on nature and biodiversity, on health, for example, on climate impacts themselves, as well as the impact of policies on living standards. Our report, for example, elaborates on the diverse range of avenues through which a change in natural capital, for example, is likely to have intergenerational effects. We also recognised through the creation of this framework that there is a degree of circularity towards a consideration of climate change policies' intergenerational effects. Rather than being linear, we recognized that the outcomes of particular policies, or the state of the world that policies bring about, will act as future inputs into subsequent policies. For example, the policies that might affect the availability of natural capital would constitute an input into future projects and future policies going forward. And I think another point of note from our framework is that it recognizes that policies do have distributional effects within generations that in turn impact future generations. The framework, for example, recognizes that policies' progressive and regressive distributional impacts can compound over time to affect well-being in future generations. And I think as we elaborate on our report, this was famously coined by the economist Alan Kruger in the Great Gatsby curve, which plots income inequality against generational earnings elasticity to lend credence to the idea that distributional effects within generations impact future levels of equality. So I think having set out the kind of high-level key points associated with our initial framework, I'll now move on to some of the emerging lessons that came about as a result of our exercise. Now, I think the first lesson refers to that earlier point that I'd made around the circular effects of, the circular nature of a consideration for policy's intergenerational effects, whereby we recognize that actually when considering policy's long-run effects, policy outcomes are likely to constitute inputs for future policies going forward. But through our exercise, we also recognize that climate change effects, that it's important to draw attention to the fact that climate change effects are associated with tipping points, as Sharon mentioned in the initial comments, where the effects of climate change will reach a point where it's either impossible or at least very challenging to reverse climate change effects, which really added greater immediacy and urgency to the climate change policies as a result of kind of the detrimental longer term effects of climate change. We also recognized that climate change policies have conjoined benefits and disbenefits across different sectors, which ought to be articulated by policymakers in order to foster greater levels of action. This was particularly relevant for climate change policies, which may be associated with particularly strong co-benefits. For example, we recognize that the health benefits of either low emission vehicles in cities or reforestation efforts have very strong positive well-being effects in addition to the decarbonisation benefits that they bring about. And lastly, the exercise also drew attention to the fact that policy actions ought to be accompanied by behavioural nudges and consumer actions in order to bring about the most beneficial outcomes. For example, improved education around environmentally friendly products and eco-labelling might drive the take-up of more environmentally friendly goods and services. And we recognise that this might be particularly relevant for climate change policies due to the sheer range of choices that have significant environmental implications for all levels of society. Behavioural policies would be able to lower many of the burdens that are associated with realising these greener outcomes. So having now set out the kind of key elements of our framework alongside some of the emerging lessons that came about as a result of our exercise, I'll now move on to the Q&A of our reports with Martin Hurst. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Matthew and Emma. I'll open this to the floor. If you can put your hands up or register in chat if you have a question you'd like to ask, I'll then ask you to switch your camera on and ask your question, and then obviously switch your camera off. So are there any questions to Matthew and Emma before we continue? I don't appear to be able to see any hands. Is that because there aren't any? Or?
It was brilliantly clear, Martin. Clear.
I can't see any hands up at the moment. Has anybody got any specific points they'd like to raise about the report? Nobody feeling brave or controversial? Ah, we have one. Jeff.
Hi everyone. So I can't resist. I'm too much of an extrovert to let the silence pervade. So I think so I really like the framework because I can see how it helps me think about intergenerational equity. What I'd want to know as a practical use of it is whether I weight any of the things differently, or can I get the same information about each of the categories so that I can do a fair analysis to decide whether or not I should put the slider more towards the current generation paying or away from it?
A very good question. I'm sure one that the panelists as well will have views on. And I think that that how do you do that weighting is maybe quintessentially one of the jobs of Parliament and government, trying to think about how to weigh up different both generations and different groups within that. There are ways in which sort of from the economics point of view and framework. We can think of weighting, of which reveal preferences around interest rates, around sort of rates of time preference, allow us to get at some of that. But we know that sometimes, well, that can be heavily biased based on how questions are asked, and also based on what precisely the issue is and how that's framed. But those kinds of thinking about sort of rates of time preference and ways of getting at rates of time preference help you weight different generations. And then the ethical discussion that we have in the report, and that's one of the jobs of Parliament to do, probably provides more qualitative evidence around that. You can see Bridget's got her hand up now actually as well.
Yeah, so Jeffrey, if you could go on, hide your video. Bridget Rosewell.
Yeah, I think this is, I hope, a question around the sort of the modelling itself, which is, in your logic model, how far do you think you were able to pick up, if you like, the non-linearities and the feedbacks between different elements of the logic? Logic tends to kind of go in one direction, yet what we've got here is something which is much more circular. Perhaps you could comment on the difficulty of doing that.
Yeah, and we have the advantage in the framework of just saying it should be done, and clearly how you do it, I think, is very specific to the particular issue, because the nature of the circularity is very different for different issues. I think we have to acknowledge that the central element of that circularity is that the actions that we take today, when it comes to climate change, have a significant impact on what the climate looks like in the future. Now, if it's actions in the UK, and we can sort of go through separate arguments about why the UK should be acting, but if it's actions in the UK, then that's going to have relatively limited impact on future climates, unless it's part of the UK sort of encouraging the rest of the world to do things. And in that respect, that specific circularity, maybe you don't have to worry about at that level of granularity. Other actions, decisions to invest in offshore wind, for example, that we've made, which have implications for future jobs, skill mix, growth of that part of GDP, as opposed to other choices we could have made, set us down sort of paths that have particular consequences. And so I think for each of these, you have to think very specifically about what is the what's the level of granularity that we're looking at, and what are the particular sort of how the causality works out, particularly for that particular issue, and try to incorporate that into the modelling. But what we haven't got in this framework yet is some worked examples, which would be a good next step for doing that.
Doesn't that raise some really significant problems of data and data availability? And indeed, how you might parameterize or make assumptions about those parameters in the absence of data?
It does, and arguably argues in favor of using scenarios and not having a sort of fixed central estimate and that you stick with. But lots of those, in sort of integrated assessment models and other ways of looking at future climate, the attempt to overcome some of that uncertainty has been made and is being made and being refined over time. But I think fundamentally what it says is that you have to look at different scenarios and try to pick based on, and often we talk about low regret scenarios or other ways of picking what action to take today and how you decide to take that action given the uncertainty. And fundamentally, going back to what I was saying in the introduction, the reason that the government's carbon values stop at 2050 is because they said it's just too uncertain for us to project those carbon values beyond 2050. But that doesn't change the fact that many of the decisions we're making now with respect to climate will affect the world post-2050. And so we need a way then of deciding amongst different possible scenarios which ones we're going to choose.
Okay, and I have a question from Sul Ali. I have to say, when I looked at the participant list and saw Sul there, I hoped you'd ask a question, Sul. So over to you.
Hi there, good afternoon. Firstly, thank you, Matthew and Arco, for a very intriguing discussion thus far. I had a look at the framework, and I quite like it. I guess the challenge I've got is very topical for me at the moment, because we're thinking about the investments we need to make over quite a critical period in the 2020s. And the challenge I get is that the pace of change in technological evolution is so uncertain and so fast as it is today. My biggest fear is that we make assumptions and build solutions for today's problems, not tomorrow's. And the best example of that is sort of electric vehicles, right? And I think that is more of a short-term problem for the UK than, say, heat. And I'm trying to apply your framework to say, okay, how would I go about changing what I do in terms of my investment plan? And I get stuck on box 2 because I think to myself, well, I could go and start to put preemptive investment in to support electric vehicles, but actually I'm going to have to make a punt on the level of smart charging, the level of energy efficiency, the level of consumer participation, all of which are currently unknown, right? So I guess I'm struggling with how what's your views on how I'll go about applying a framework like this that actually helps me make decisions?
Yeah, and it may, I think I'm probably talking too much, and it may be that Maxine or even Pauline from the Ofgem point of view want to jump in on some of those topics. But I think we do have to look at, going back to what we were saying in the discussion with Bridget, we do have to look at the range of different scenarios and then be able to judge across them what is most likely to be most beneficial relative to the costs. And that's not, I mean, it might be it might be even more noticeable in climate change, but whether education policy or criminal justice policy or all areas of public policy, we're always taking a bit of a punt on the future and about what needs to be done today, knowing that we have imperfect information about what the right decision is, and knowing that in retrospect, and one of the things we point out in our framework clearly is the risk of stranded costs. In retrospect, there's almost inevitably going to be some stranded costs because there'll be things that we don't anticipate. But the alternative is to do literally nothing. And so it is about how do we assess across the range of possible futures, not so much the most likely outcome, but the actions we can take today that possibly apply to the widest range of futures that we can think about now.
Thanks very much. And now, Catherine Brown, this seems to be a kind of symposium of formal climate change commission people. Over to you, Catherine.
I've thought of a question now, which is about puffins. So this is relevant. So I'm trying to think through in my new role. So I've just moved from the CCC to be Director of Climate Change at the Wildlife Trusts. And one of the thorniest things that we're having to think through to begin with is, what are we trying to achieve in conservation as the climate changes? So generally speaking, we can no longer assume that we're trying to conserve what was there historically, because that has gone. We now need to move into a kind of new arena, if you like, of nature conservation. And things are moving from protecting species like puffins to protecting processes and landscapes. And this is politically, with a very small p, within the nature conservation movement, that's a very tricky issue to get our heads around as to how we make those choices. Does the framework help us to think that through, would you say? Because can we start to put values on how much does somebody value a puffin versus how much does somebody value a whole landscape or a whole process? And I use puffins because those are one of the species that we think we may not be able to do anything to help as we go into the future.
I think probably just an initial reflection from myself on this was that I think from my understanding, the framework, as Matthew sort of alluded to, is partly designed to speak to a kind of a broad cross-section of particular policies as well. So I suppose in the case of a puffin conservation, that really speaks a lot to kind of natural capital and biodiversity, whereas kind of, I suppose, other policies such as electric vehicles and heat pumps along those lines might have a lot more salience put upon questions around economic inputs and stranding risks. In terms of more specific subjective questions, I think this was really an area that perhaps speaks to a lot of maybe slightly more to kind of these ethical considerations of the extent to which we actually have obligations to nature in and of itself, or obligations to landscapes and habitats. And this was something that we perhaps struggled with a lot more, because there's a greater degree of subjectivity to these sorts of more specific, nuanced and ethical questions. We did note that I think in many of the literature that we came across, in particular the Dasgupta review and earlier on in the Stern review, that they went quite some way in terms of elaborating and articulating the importance and benefits of preserving biodiversity landscapes, which I imagine is very relevant with regard to puffin habitats as well. And also setting out a lot of the ethical justifications for why we might want to preserve these habitats. I think the Dasgupta review goes into further detail around different justice frameworks and ethical frameworks that can kind of set out why we have obligations to nature as being kind of linked to something more transcendental in us, and a range of ethical kind of points around that. But I think it really speaks to a lot of the subjectivity of these questions, which will inevitably vary by kind of policymakers and kind of be impacted by citizen engagement as well. So I think the framework is helpful in terms of setting out these kind of a broad framework for considering these questions, but it elaborates somewhat in terms of these more subjective questions without being able to provide kind of an objective answer to us having to apply X weight to puffins or other kind of habitats and wildlife species too.
So I have one final question, and then we need to move on from Maxine. Maxine, for Sustainability Hurst first and co-host of one of the future sessions. Maxine.
So cheating by getting in early. It's really just kind of following the questions that others have asked about kind of how practically do they use this. Emma, you talked about this at the beginning as being a logic model. Now, obviously, you know, in an ideal world, we're going to put numbers onto everything and churn a handle and the answer will pop out. But I had seen this more as a framework for structuring thinking, at least as a first step. So, I mean, is that a right interpretation? And does that in any way help any of the previous participants who were struggling about exactly what numbers they might feed in at different points?
Yes, no, thank you very much for flagging that also, Maxine. I think, yes, that characterization that you put forward is kind of being a framework and checklist of kind of considerations that policy makers can go through when considering sort of the intergenerational effects of policies. Is yeah, absolutely right. The kind of use of a logic model in our case was really to map out rather the different kind of ways in which a policy might impact on future generations. So going from the cause of the policy to the final effect being like long run impacts upon well-being, and we'd kind of mapped that causally through different inputs that go into the project, go into the policy, the results of the particular policy, and then the state of the world that the policy brings about as well. So I think the reference to the use of a logic model in our case was more along the lines of mapping out logically and causally the diverse range of avenues through which a particular policy might impact the well-being of future generations.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much to Matthew and Emma for the presentations, which I thought were really interesting. One final question, actually, we do just have time, from Jenny Saunders. You can keep it quick, Jenny. You're on mute.
I think you might be on mute there, Jenny.
Sorry, yeah, sorry. It was prompted by Maxine's question, really. So what makes this framework specifically helpful for thinking about climate change? Because when I was looking at it, I thought perhaps if it had been considered for the social care policy, we might not be in such a mess over that, thinking about fairness. What would be really unique for us thinking about climate change using this model?
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, there's a sense to which any very long-term decisions you could put into a sort of similar framework. We have in this particular framework, clearly we've highlighted both outputs and policy outcomes that are particular to climate change and issues around climate change. And so the particular issues that we discuss are climate related. You could try to replace them with other issues that are maybe linked to social care or linked to other sort of longer term and longer running issue challenges for society. But what we've put forward and the particular issues we highlight, are in that climate change context. And maybe linked to that, and also to Maxine's point, one of the other things in the full report that we didn't get a chance to discuss in our slides is a series of sort of prompting questions that we've included, questions that somebody undertaking the analysis, and back to some of the earlier questions, somebody undertaking the analysis might use the questions to try to guide themselves through the thinking in a systematic way. And those questions are clearly specific to thinking about climate issues, but notionally one could have a different set of questions for thinking about a different set of issues.
Okay, I think we're going to
now turn to Peter Davis. So we now turn to Peter Davis, who we've asked to give 10 minutes commentary on the work from Frontier. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Martin, and thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, in terms of my 10 minutes is not going to be so much of a commentary, but a sort of a set of reflections, really. And first of all, to say how timely this piece of work is, and how needed it is in terms of providing policymakers with decision-making tools for the long term. I think it's particularly timely today, and this event is particularly timely because in about 20 minutes at 4 p.m. is the launch of the Future Generations Commission, which Lord Bird is launching today in the Houses of Parliament as part of the movement to support and establish a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act at Westminster. And of course, that's where my background comes from. I was a part of the Sustainable Development Commission. I was chair of the Climate Change Commission. But more importantly, I was involved in putting together and working with colleagues and indeed leading a national conversation on the Wales We Want that led to the establishment of the Wellbeing of Future Generation Wales Act in 2015. And I think it's that experience which highlights for me the importance of the sort of tool that we have being developed here and the sort of thinking that's being applied to that. The Act built on a constitutional requirement as part of the devolution settlement to undertake sustainable development. It was incorporated into the Government of Wales Act. I led this national conversation in my role as Commissioner on the Wales We Want. It helped to inform the Act itself by helping to shape the long-term goals that the Act sets out. The well-being goals are national well-being goals linked to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Those goals are underpinned by indicators and milestones and common ways of working, which apply to the 40 or so public bodies that are responsible that the Act covers. And it's overseen, of course, by an independent commissioner, the Commissioner for Future Generations. Now we're 5 years into the implementation of that, and there are some important lessons. And I think one lesson is the fact that decision makers and policy makers need better tools to inform the process that is required in terms of implementing the Act. It's definitely changed the dialogue on the conversation. So it's opened up the opportunity for that sort of discussion about the sort of decision-making tools and processes that this framework sets out. It's been seen to develop and deliver a greater collaboration across public bodies. It's certainly requiring the involvement of citizens to a much greater extent. And there's a real challenge in that. And I think it's one of the themes of my reflection, is that the framework itself needn't be thought of in terms of simply an internal policy making process, but a process by which we engage the wider understanding of public and citizens, and engage those people in that process of deciding, making decisions for the long term. The Act has empowered a new office, and so it's of course put in place a commissioner for future generations, setting agendas and hopefully holding government to account. And if you want to read more about all of the history of the Act and its current experience, then Jane Davidson, the minister who helped to put it in place, has written a book, Lessons from a Small Country, and I'll put some of these links into the chat after I finish. So the key point for me is the fact that we need more of this sort of thinking in terms of aligning decision making to the sort of vision for the long term that piece of legislation sets out. The legislation itself is a framework, and it's interesting that the Scottish government are now planning to legislate for a similar framework. And as I mentioned, there is a process going on through Westminster to see whether there can be a Wellbeing for Future Generations bill introduced into UK Parliament as well, being led by Lord Burke. The hashtag Today for Tomorrow is the campaign slogan, the campaign message. So government has got that blind spot, in terms of planning for the long term, and social care has been mentioned. Climate change, of course, is the classic example of that. Governments are driven by short-termism, and the democratic process has some of the challenges of democratic process in terms of short-termism, the immediacy of the democratic process, the short-term cycle of elections, the responses to the ever-shortening news cycle, 24-hour news, and the fact, of course, that future generations are not represented in that debate, and in their interests there isn't a voice for them, which is why the Commissioner was introduced in Wales to try and give that voice to future generation. I particularly point to a publication. This is from Professor Graham Smith. Graham chairs the Foundation for Democracy and Sustainable Development. I'm a trustee of that foundation, and it's an interesting publication that sets out some of the issues around the democratic process and decision making for the long term. Graham particularly highlights the need to deepen the democratic process and to engage citizens. And I think that's one of my key reflections about this process. It has to have citizen involvement at the heart of it. And we've seen examples of that in terms of citizens' assemblies being an example of how that can be used to enable community-led action that can support policy making and decision making by government. There isn't often the view, I think, that public short-sightedness is one of the driving factors behind short-term politics. But I think if you look at the analysis of this, public perspectives on future generations are determined by context. In running the national conversation on the Wales we want, a striking feature was that the grandparents were the most focused on the long view. In chairing the customer challenge group for Welsh Water, working to ensure that the company plans meet the needs of customers, current customers and future customers. If you inform and frame the discussion about future infrastructure and the needs in the context of climate change, you get a very different response than if it's framed at a transactional level of day-to-day decision making around paying the bill. And I think it's instructive, certainly for me in chairing that group, when you work with customers and you put that long-term frame, it's clear that their view of the importance of long-term decision making comes through very clearly, the importance of long-term investment. Indeed, in that process, it was clear that the customers didn't want their bill to be reduced. Indeed, a majority were happy to see an increase in their bill if they were clear about where that investment was being made and the outcome of that. But of course, the result from the regulator, from Ofwat, was a reduction in bills in the price review process, which from the perspective of the customer challenge group was against what the customer was saying in terms of the importance of that long-term investment. So an example of where, if you like, the short-term, I think possibly even political imperative to reduce bills won out over the longer-term investment requirements that the sector requires. So I would put the framework in this longer-term, wider context of the movement that we have, I think, to consider much more the needs of future generations. I've mentioned the legislative developments here in Wales, and obviously similar developments planned in Scotland, and the debate that's happening now virtually as we're talking in Westminster in terms of the importance of a Future Generations Commission in order to give some structure that can better deliver decision making for the long term. And what we need to underpin that are some of the policy making tools that this framework can begin, I think, as part of the process of developing going forward. So just some reflections. As I say, I'll drop some of those links into the chat if you want to find out any further about some of the points that I've mentioned.
Thank you, Peter. That's really helpful, and it's really stimulating to hear how you built out from your experience in Wales, and how the tool that we're developing here might be something that might be useful for the new Future Generations Commission proposals in Westminster. I'm going to hand over to Maxine now for part 2 of our day.
Right, thank you. Thank you to Frontier and Peter for really getting us off to a flying start. Before I bring in the rest of the panel, I just wanted to share with you the recommendations that we had put out in our Viewpoint, building on the Frontier work. It's not the whole answer. As we've said, this is very much an attempt to get a conversation going around this area. But we wanted to have some concrete actions that would help take the debate forward. So as Matthew indicated, this is very much about bringing together two worlds. And as we saw it, there's a world around the kind of ethics that takes you into thinking about principles and questions of fairness. And indeed, Sustainability First are about to kick off a piece of work on sustainability principles, of which this is one of the principles that we're trying to work out how principles can be used to inform policy making. But then inevitably the policymakers on the ground need to kind of have some analysis to support their decisions about the different options and ways forward. And so there are some nitty-gritty analytical tool points that we need to think about as well. And our recommendations cover both of these. So the first one is very much supporting what Peter's just been talking about and saying, we can see real merit in having a well-being of Future Generations Act at Westminster. So we'll keep an eye out for the launch of that later today. Launch of that commission later today. The second one is about saying we need we need some consensus around how to think about these issues, and that's what this process is about, and to try to get that dialogue going. And we, like Peter, have picked up on the importance here of kind of engagement with citizens. And going back to Jeff's question earlier about where do you put the slider? I think engagement with citizens is one of the ways where you learn how to calibrate some of those moral and ethical questions that underpin all of these considerations. And then our third kind of meta type of point is moving to that measure of inclusive wealth, not just looking at kind of economic analysis, but building, as the Dasgupta review highlighted, to think about natural capital and inclusive wealth, and a broader measure of what kind of future we're worried about. So those are the high-level recommendations. We then have three that are slightly more on the analytical end, which is this discussion in the Frontier report about having a lower social discount rate, reflecting the fact that future generations may not be better off, and these challenges are potentially irreversible if we hit tipping points. It's something that Treasury are known to already be looking at, with the lower social discount rate on health, and we would encourage them to take forward that work and to provide guidance as to whether this is an appropriate approach. We then perhaps pull out Ofgem in particular, because the debates that are going on at the minute is still highlighted about how much investment should the networks be allowed through their current price control. And there's really a narrow path to be navigated here between the risk of having stranded assets if too much is invested and it turns out to be the wrong technology, but also really the risk of underinvesting, which means that we are too late. We can't get the investment in place that we need to meet the net zero challenge, or only at a very much higher cost, particularly in the face of all the uncertainty that exists. So it's sometimes a lot easier to see the costs that are associated with overinvesting, the costs associated with investing, but it's harder to pull out the downsides and the risks of underinvesting. So a conscious effort by Ofgem to kind of make sure that it's looking equally at both sides of the coin. And then the final one that we've pulled out in our viewpoint is to look at the wider co-benefits. So Ammar touched on health, employment, the things that are in their framework that need to be given explicit consideration when looking at plans for investment. So those were the 6 recommendations that we pulled out in our viewpoint. I just want to throw in one bonus one, which is I'm starting to think about a bit more now, which is it's just being transparent about these impacts. And it's a point we've raised on other elements of distributional impacts and fairness. Sometimes considerations about discount rates or asset lives get relegated to the finance annexes of Ofgem decisions, but are absolutely fundamental to who pays what and how much over the generations. So looking at the bill impacts out to 2050, not just over the next price control period, will really highlight what the choices are and what those trade-offs need to be in terms of the distributional impacts. So a kind of transparency is key to getting that wider debate going. So that's a bonus one I've thrown in without consulting Sharon. Anyway, so that's the Sustainability First sort of set of recommendations from our viewpoint. And with that, I'd like to welcome the panel who we're asking to kind of each share with us a few of their own reflections on this difficult topic, difficult and important topic, and then we'll open out to questions. Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and again, links with the Committee on Climate Change.
Hi, thanks ever so much, and thanks for the invitation to talk about this really important set of issues, and in a set of issues that, in a sense, we've been thinking on and off about for a long time, and this was very central to. Sorry, my screen keeps jumping around at the moment. This was very central to the whole Stern review, of course, and I remember as part of that, being involved in that review, spending a lot of time actually with Nick and the members of his team talking about exactly these issues and exactly the importance of using the very low discount rates, and exactly the importance of thinking about these things differently in the context of climate change. I remember particularly one thing that I think it was Nick saying that actually across public policy we don't really recognise quite often the long-term consequences of decisions that we make. So use the example of the A1, which still follows the route of the old Roman road, which itself follows the route of very much pre-Roman roads. So decisions taken today have immensely long-lasting consequences, which never really get taken account of in public policy decisions. I'm very pleased to see the focus on ethics in this framework. It's something that I think politicians and policymakers are embarrassed to talk about. I actually wrote an article, one of my columns in the Times a year or so ago, about the whole response to the COVID pandemic. And I, unlike most economists who say, well, I hope that, there's lots of economists involved in this, I said, actually, I hope there's some ethicists and philosophers involved in this, because the decisions that are being made in the end, yes, they need to be informed by science, but my goodness, they need to be informed by a clear sense of the ethical framework that you're working in. And that's certainly true, of climate change. I suppose my big question about this is how this question now, what is the relevance of this question now? Because I think we've made these decisions in response to climate change. We have a net zero target. That was in itself a huge ethical decision. I mean, in a sense, the government said, well, look, let's not mess around with deciding what the appropriate shadow price of carbon ought to be for the next 30 years, and let's cut through all that, and let's say the right decision, and this was done, the decision was made on an ethical basis more than anything else. The right decision is to get our carbon emissions down to zero, and we're going to do that over the next 30 years. And within that context, we then have to decide what the most effective and efficient way of getting there is. So the big ethical decision, I think, has been made. Now, there are questions about whether we'll actually keep to it. And there are within that a lot of big distributional questions about who, in particular, questions about who pays. And I think it's right that, and the Treasury in its net zero review at the moment is thinking about that very hard. We've made, I think, some dubious ethical decisions over the last decade. Most of the progress we've made has been through decarbonising the electricity sector, paid entirely through bills, and therefore in a regressive fashion. So I think there have been some dubious decisions made in that basis. I don't think there's been much thought given to the intergenerational impacts within the constraints of the decisions that we're currently making. But I'm not sure how big a set, this is an interesting question, I'm not sure how big a set of choices that is, again, given that 2050 target. I mean, we could be, and it's an interesting question, and one that relates to some of the debates about historic responsibility for climate change between nations. We could be saying to the older generation now that, as part of a generation that has been responsible for carbon emissions, we should be asking more from them. I think that would be a pretty hard sell, given that we don't seem to be even able to ask them for any money for their own social care, according to the tax rises that we've seen this week. So I think that's there are issues there, and there are certainly specific issues within specific elements here. But I suppose rather unhelpfully, I think my key conclusion is that the main role of this, I think, is probably as a way of keeping the government's feet to the fire to maintain and retain the decisions they've apparently already made. And one can imagine, without too much difficulty, a world in which, for one reason or another, they decide to start resiling from that. And then I think having a very strong set of ethical arguments and framework for why they were right in the first place and become wrong later on will be very important. And finally, you know, the bit of the climate change policy or our response to climate change that worries me from the point of view as risks to it is that I still don't think most of the population have even begun to get their head around what this might actually mean. I mean, the most obvious example being, you know, going into 30 million houses and ripping out the boilers and, you know, and doing whatever we need to do to that. People are going to find that rather disturbing. They're also going to find it rather disturbing if flights become very expensive or rationed, and if there are other significant changes to their lives in a way that there absolutely has not been as a result of what we've done so far. So I do think, despite what I just said all about, you know, about where government and policy is, I'm not sure that the population is yet there, because I don't think they've understood the price they will have to pay. And I don't mean in an economic sense or in a sort of pounds sense. I mean in a sort of change to their lifestyle sense. And I think within that context, having this as part of the public debate is actually really important.
Well, thank you, Paul. I mean, I certainly agree with you that, you know, the decision to go for net zero is absolutely a decision that's kind of taken on that ethical basis, and shows the importance of that kind of framing of these issues. You weren't going to get there by doing a cost-benefit analysis. I still do see a lot of difficult decisions that are left to how we actually make it happen, where people are battling between short-term bill impacts and the ability to hit net zero, and particularly in the face of uncertainty. But perhaps turn now to those on the panel who perhaps are at the end of having to do some of those those difficult decisions around investment. Directly, first of all, Maureen. So Maureen Paul, sorry, I should have said interim chief economist at Ofgem.
Excellent, thanks, Maxine. So yeah, for me, the report is a welcome contribution to the debate, and it makes, you know, important and thought-provoking points. The overall purpose of the framework, it chimes with the thinking that we're doing in Ofgem right now. So in addition to the intra-generational impacts that we look at, I absolutely agree that we need to also focus on the intergenerational impacts, which is what the report helpfully provides a framework for. And, you know, thinking also about fairness. So I think we certainly need to be doing more of that than we've done in the past. And we recognize that our decisions made today, you know, which we've kind of touched on earlier, to help achieve net zero, that will have implications for energy consumers in the future. So it's that, you know, circularity that we talked about earlier. And it's not just in the context of network assets with 20-year asset lives, for instance, but also on EV charging, the functioning of the retail market, decarbonisation of heat, and you know, much more. So I guess it's another voice saying that the framework is a very welcome, positive step. So at Ofgem, we are actively considering how we assess the impact of our decisions on current and future generations. And of course, that's in our duty. And our own impact assessment guidance that follows the Green Book. Last year, I think March or May, but the month begins with an M, we refreshed the guidance to set out more detailed thinking on how we would be assessing the impact using the CCC pathways to net zero, so in the context of that. We also published a distributional impacts framework where we set out how we will assess the expected impacts of our decisions on different groups of energy consumers, looking at bill impacts. Yeah. It will be vital to, of course, have the right tools, generating robust outputs to help us make those decisions, right, and to understand the impacts. But you know, putting that aside, I wanted to just reflect on some parts of the report that particularly resonated with me, and in doing so, I will raise some questions which I think there is room for further exploration. And the three ones are on ethical considerations, the implications for analysts, and data. So I just want to give some reflections on the three, but there will be some questions which I hope informs, you know, further research as we go forward. So on ethical consideration, there I'm thinking about the boundaries between regulatory and government policy. So as the report correctly highlights, there is the important ethical and political dimension to the debate. And as a regulator, our primary duty is to protect the interests of current and future consumers. We also need to deliver an economically efficient system. So in this context, if we are striving for economic efficiency, how far does our redistributive role extend, right, is a question. So should we be seeking to mitigate the adverse distributional impacts before they happen? Or should we prepare for government policy to correct these impacts once they've happened? We already have a very strong focus, of course, on protecting consumers with vulnerable characteristics. So should we be extending this to other non-vulnerable groups? And that is something, you know, we've been thinking about, which I expect will increase in importance as time goes on. So, you know, often we look at the domestic sector, but of course there is the non-domestic sector. They are consumers as well. So it is a debate that, you know, we are having. And I took a look at the annex of the report where it rightly highlights that votes, consumer decisions can bring legitimacy to governments and brands, and that behavioral nudges can be important in helping consumers make the right choices to help achieve net zero. But what if some of these groups are unable or unwilling to make these choices? How much support from public bodies should they receive? What incentives need to be in place to make this happen? And what is the balance between imposing cost on consumers for making choices that are incompatible with net zero versus ensuring they can make savings for making the choices that are, you know, supportive of net zero? So these are some difficult questions that, you know, I know that does not necessarily have straightforward answers. So I'll move on to the second one, which I mentioned is about the implications for analysts. And there I'm thinking about equity weights. So the report talks about the implication for us as economists and more generally analysts. And typically the approach so far has been to conduct analysis and present it without value judgments attached, well, as far as possible anyway. But given the enormity of the challenge to reach net zero and the consequences of course, not doing so, we may find that we cannot avoid the value judgments being part of our work. There may be an argument for, you know, including equity weights as a matter of course in our work, so not as exception, but as a matter of course, which would allow us to give added weight to impacts on consumers, for instance, on low incomes. Also thinking about, you know, how you'd weight different generations. Though the value of those weights requires us to make value judgments, it is something we need to think about how we, you know, we get comfortable with that and incorporate it, which is what the, you know, the framework helps us to think about. And the third bit is on the data, and there I'm thinking about measuring impacts more specifically. So one of the biggest challenges that we face is around data availability and its robustness. Now, in terms of availability, I'm referring here to data on consumer behavior. And I think Matthew mentioned about doing surveys to get people's, you know, to understand what people's preferences are. So yeah, I'm referring here to data on consumer behavior and how the consumers would respond to net zero policies. Now, we've done randomized controlled trials in the past, at least one. And they are the most effective way of gathering robust data on how consumers will respond. But these are expensive and they're complicated to administer. We also know the window of time, to make these decisions to ensure we reach net zero, that's closing. And that goes to the point, the tipping point we talked about earlier. And therefore, so too is the opportunity to carry out these large-scale randomized trials, right? And I think that's why it's important we look beyond the UK, Great Britain, to other countries as well to see what, to assess what evidence there is out there in terms of what works, because we may not have the time and it's quite expensive to do those randomized controlled trials. So we need to look further out. The other aspect on robustness is around predicting what society will look like and how consumers will behave in that future. It may feel too uncertain, and we talked about that, and that we shouldn't try, but it's doing nothing. And Matthew, touched on that too in response to a question earlier. But we can develop some scenarios and future states, which Matthew talked about, accepting that we may be wrong about aspects of them. So this is a challenge we are considering ourselves as we look to refresh our approach to assessing distributional impact. So it's a piece that we're actively looking at the moment. So looking at the future,
we nearly there. Yep.
Yes. So looking at the future, we will be developing our own framework for assessing the impact of net zero, and this is something we're hoping to develop in the next few months. And what we do expect is to be engaging closely with government, with academics, think tanks, and other regulators. So I'll stop here. I'm sure I went over time.
Thanks, Maureen. That's really helpful. And I mean, your opening comments really about some of those attempting to put an ethical view into when you're doing that detailed analytical work also highlights for me the importance of government giving you a strategy and policy statement, as we've been arguing for some time, and they have now said that they will do, because that is one way of that democratic voice feeding into the analytical frameworks, because it can't just be coming out straight from the numbers. So finally, well, not finally, actually, we've got got a few more to do. Next on our panel, we've got Bridget Rosewell, as the Commissioner with the National Infrastructure Commission. Bridget, over to you.
Thank you, Maxine, and thanks to everybody for what is so far a pretty fascinating set of thought-provoking options, challenges, no answers. And I guess I want to really perhaps try and come at this from a slightly different direction. Firstly, after all, what's fair is something which can be quite personal, and different groups, different people have different ideas about fairness, whether it's between groups or across time and generations. So I think we've got to be careful not to assume that there's one right answer to the question of fairness. And it's very easy, particularly as a policymaker, to think that there's a right answer out there. And if only I try harder and I collect more data, I'll be able to find it. I know that this is easy because I used to believe in that myself. I used to believe that more data, bigger model, guess it better, and eventually we'll come up with the right answer. And it became apparent to me over the last 20 years that you just can't. Life is nature, we're too complex. There are too many groups, too many issues, too many interests to be able to get that right, even assuming that you could collect the data, which you can't. So that variety and diversity, I think, has to be at the heart of the way we think about these sorts of things. And that brings me really to the kind of second way that I kind of try to think about this. And I've tried to think about this in the Infrastructure Commission and in the first National Infrastructure Assessment that we did, which is what are the scenarios I might imagine, but in any detail, but what do I have to believe for this kind of thing to be important, worth doing, and how plausible are those things? In the context of the infrastructure assessment, just to give you a kind of an example, not so much specifically climate change related, it's things like saying, I cannot imagine a world in which I don't want more broadband. So more broadband investment is going to be a worthwhile thing to do. We can then talk about the hows and the whys, but we've got a kind of that initial way of thinking about it. On the other hand, at the other end of that thing, I can imagine many scenarios in which hydrogen isn't an answer, because we don't manage to produce some technologies in which we can produce it at the right scale. I'm beginning to kind of see an evolution there, but there's still a lot of uncertainty about that particular area, which means it can't be the area that I bet on, because there are so many scenarios in which it might not happen. That's very different from saying, let's have so many scenarios or do some Monte Carlo or whatever, where again, you get trapped by the existing data, which is inadequate. And in any case, other bit of mantra, the future is going to be different from the past. So the past data is only a very imperfect, it's maybe all you've got, but it's a very imperfect guide to the future. So we don't have the data. The past is not a guide to the future, even if we do. We actually lack the imagination, I think, to devise all of the scenarios or analyze all the scenarios that we might want to have. So we need to turn it on its head. When you turn it on its head, then I think your recommendation 2 absolutely comes into its own, because those are exactly the ways in which you can get ordinary people and deliberative assemblies and so on to engage in a topic. You don't say, here's our scenario, these are the numbers, that's the cost benefit ratio, da-di-da. You come up with a whole load of stuff, which is, and billions, incidentally. Billions don't mean anything outside the rarefied worlds of policymakers, because these numbers are too large to be grounded in your own individual experience. So, but you can do deliberative work. And I thought what Peter was saying, and I have also got experience of consumers in water saying, we don't want the bills to come down, we'd rather invest in the security of our water supply, and Ofwat coming along and saying, oh no, you've got to have the bills come down. That deliberative, getting better backup for the effectiveness of those deliberative experiences and the deliberative assemblies, I think is incredibly important, because in the end, government follows. Government is short, as we've already said, government tends to be short-sighted. Grandparents aren't. Grandparents think about their grandchildren. They actually do have long-term perspectives. And in fact, in a way, the older you are, the longer your perspective, because you can see how much things change and how much things have changed. And you have experience of a world which operated differently. So we can leverage that and use it to both develop some thinking about what most people think is fair, because not everybody's ever going to think that the same things are fair, but also to give the, if you like, the welly to politicians who are willing to take some of those long-term decisions, what is it, courageous decisions in Yes Minister terminology. We've made some, as Paul said, we've made some decisions about net zero and going to an early and brave decision. That was courageous. But we now need to make sure that that is, as I think, again, Paul said, we need to try and work out how to engage people so that they have a better understanding and willingness to engage in that debate, to understand that an air source heat pump produces hot water at 10 degrees lower than their gas boiler did, and that we can think about who pays and how they pay. About which, Paul, I won't repeat any of that, because that was a very valid way of thinking about those distributional consequences for people who are now going to pay, because the taxpayer is still a current person, There is no unborn person paying taxes or paying a bill. So that distributional consequence is for now and for the current people. But those current people themselves do think about long-term futures, and they may think about long-term futures. You know, the younger generation thinking that you can do this immediately and you know, protesting and getting out pink tables, and may have a different view as to how you can implement that, but they're not necessarily thinking any more long-term. Indeed, they may be thinking more short-term than some of the older generations. So we shouldn't think about fairness as something which is always to be represented by a policymaker for a start, or always only in the self-interest. This is the economist's canard, if you like, to think that everybody works on self-interest. The only thing I've learned in a misspent life is we do not. And we need to leverage people's willingness to act in the more general interest, which they do all the time. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really heartening contribution, and I think it does kind of reinforce, I think, a theme that we've all come back to, that actually the ordinary person probably gets this, and our challenge as policymakers is how to capture that and use that to inform our thinking. Finally, on our panel, we've got Martin Hurst from Sustainability First. Martin, I'm going to be really cheeky and ask you, given that I've indulged the rest of the panel, to try to keep your comments to just a couple of minutes. But
okay, so I'm here because I was for 30 years a civil servant in the Treasury, number 10, and on the environment. So this is very much an idea whose time has come, the kind of idea of the framework. We've heard about the changes to the Green Book, strategic policy statements, sixth carbon budget, etc. I'd add to that mix the Environment Bill, which is actually also seeking to hold bits of government and others to account on some of this stuff, particularly actually the natural environment. However, all of this, and economists will recognise the phrase, is necessary but not sufficient. And what I want to do is identify 3 areas where it would be particularly difficult to get this kind of approach embedded, each of which are really important. So the first one is Treasury. In my experience, the Treasury is a number of departments, but when push comes to shove, 90% of the time, the spending department will win over the economic department. And it's interesting that even the Environment Bill has a let-out clause for the spending review. The second area is government move far too quickly to get to project analysis rather than policy analysis. And that is why Lord Deben, for example, was so frustrated in the sixth carbon budget that government is thinking about particular projects and infrastructure and not thinking about behaviour change. And actually, the combination of the two is unambiguously lower cost than either one by itself. The third thing is you can hardly move at the moment for bits of environmental data, environmental analysis, etc. There is practically nothing systematic on social analysis in the long term. And in particular, the short-term requirements of welfare spending have systematically dominated any thinking about long-term welfare systems. And indeed, at the moment, I strongly suspect the government are trying to duck the issue even further by pushing vulnerability even more onto utility bills, whereas actually there is a big conversation, if you want, to be had about how far the state should support those who will be disadvantaged by climate change and by net zero. And that conversation is simply not happening to the extent that it is happening on environment. So I think the really biggest challenge, therefore, is how do you get the notion of frameworks, the notion of intergenerational equity, the notion of long-term social into the mindset of politicians where there is an institutionalized 5-year time period, and into the mindset of regulatory chief executives, or chairs in particular, when they have a mind to their legacy and to their reappointment. So I think the framework, all the framework stuff is excellent, but for me, the big unanswered question is how do you move from frameworks to culture in government? And I think that is the challenge we haven't yet met. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. And I mean, that really echoes a comment Matthew made about the blind spot. I think it was Peter, about the blind spot of politicians, and the phrase that Mark Carney coined about the tragedy of the horizon, which is sort of, so many of these people have an inherent interest in that short term, what happens in the short term, and then it won't be around when the long term comes to bite. We have just a couple of minutes now, and I hope that we've got a few questions. Again, if people could put their hands up, and then I'll also ask people to be clear where they come from when they speak. I mean, if there's not anybody waving, you can still put up your hand, but I might just go back around the panel. I mean, we've had some very different views. You know, is the answer, there isn't a problem, we've done it all? Do we need more analysis, or is this something that is not subject to analysis? And these two worlds, and I think we've had advocates on the panel for kind of both sides. Really just kind of almost skimming back through the panel, is there anything that your later panelists have said that you would like to respond to? I mean, obviously,
I'm happy to try to come back in, Maxine, based on the discussion that's happened so far.
Yeah.
And in particular, I guess to agree with Paul in the sense that I think some of the big, in a sense, ethical decision was made, and the decision to go with net zero, as several people have said, that big ethical choice was made. And then I think what follows from that is there are a series of decisions about how you implement that sort of macro level decision. And even if government doesn't resile from the decision, and future governments don't resile from the decision, I guess it will be tempting for individual institutions to buckle in the face of some of the challenges that decision poses. And maybe that's in part how the framework can be useful, is that it provides a way of thinking that can provide some comfort to, and obviously it needs further development, but that can provide some comfort to institutions trying to make decisions that are consistent with that macro level decision around net zero. And in providing that comfort, gives them greater reassurance that if they are forcing 30 million households to change their boilers, or restricting flights, or whatever it is, that having gone through a process of thinking why those are the right decisions, can be more confident in the decisions that they've made, whatever they may be. And in some ways that touches on Bridget's point as well, about, which I agree with, about maybe the starting point is, what do you need to believe in order for some of these things to be true, as much as running lots of scenarios. And I guess the way the framework might help, and some of the questions posed in the framework might help in that respect, is that it's true, looking today, you might say, under virtually any world I can think of, I believe that broadband will be important. But 20 years ago, we wouldn't have said that. And the question is, what are the issues now where we might in 20 years time have changed our minds? And can we imagine a world where nobody flies, or very few people fly? Or can we imagine a world where nobody uses gas in any meaningful way? And we might actually not be able to believe that, but that doesn't mean that in 20 years time, it won't be a credible belief. And so thinking through again in a systematic way, and the sort of way that the framework provides, might provide some comfort that in making those decisions, many of which are not sort of obvious today, in making those decisions, we've done so in a systematic way, in a way that we can then look back on and be clear when it comes to discussing it with population, discussing things with everybody, why we reached the conclusions we reached.
Thanks, Matthew. So another offer to anybody else that wants, any other participants. Judith Ward.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wonder if we've anything useful at all we can add about the question of leadership and, if you like, the hard yards of implementation. You know, Bridget, you said there's no single right answer to some of these things, and I'm sure that's right. But we seem to accept that both the politicians and, in a way, deliberative engagement need to be kind of in lockstep, and that the two can't get too far ahead of the other or we lose everybody. And yet one kind of feels that underlying this, that somewhere there is an issue about, I think Bridget again used, you know, the term that to have the welly, you know, the courage to actually, for the politicians at some point, to get ahead on the hard yards of implementation. And I think that's what Paul, in a way, is alluding to, is we've got the target, but actually everybody's now looking at the sort of very rocky politics of the hard yards of implementation. I obviously don't have the answer, but I think it's something in a way that we still, with the framework, haven't really got our heads around. I was just struck yesterday that a former Archbishop of Canterbury and a rabbi came out for assisted dying in some limited circumstances, clearly wanting to show leadership. And in a way, you know, on social care, we've got it in spades, that, you know, Dilnot showed leadership years ago. So external voices can support that, those hard yards of implementation. But I still think there is this gap, and falling into this trap of saying it's all about deliberative engagement, I think lets the politicians off the hook around long-termism. Anyway, I've said enough. I don't have the answers, but I still think we need to reflect on that bit of the framework.
Bridget, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, I think that I do think that to some extent these things do have to go in lockstep. So politicians in a democratic or even a quasi-democratic society have to respond to the people who are going to or not going to elect them. And that does constrain them, or it can certainly constrain, you know, that they take a particular, they may wrongly interpret what their electors think. So dictators can get away with telling us exactly what it is we have to do, and you can construe that as leadership. But in all other circumstances, leaders without followers are merely eccentrics. And therefore, to engage in leadership, you also need to engage in creating followership, if you like. You need the followers. So that is, I think, why these two things have to be linked together.
And I think it's a lockstep, because the leaders, you know, what people think will also be shaped by what they hear from those in positions of authority, but they can't get too far ahead. I think that's absolutely right.
And we can see that in social care, because we can see in all of the, you know, reports that were produced decades ago, which didn't get the buy-in and didn't get that kind of, you know, the idea whose time has come is the statement, isn't it?
Martin, do you want to quick?
Yeah, just very briefly, in my experience, senior politicians have an endemic problem with bandwidth. So they can only really do things that are either immediate, and this isn't, second, of overwhelming political necessity because they are under so much pressure from external factors, or third, the one or two things they have a genuine conviction about. Now, I can't speak for the conviction, but the way to get this on the agenda is for as Bridget said, is for it to become a sufficiently important political issue for sufficiently large numbers of people in the political world that it is harder for politicians not to engage than to engage. And that's partly deliberative, it's partly things like Extinction Rebellion and such like, it's partly more legitimate factors, but it won't happen until one of those three things happens. It's either an immediate issue, it's an overwhelming political issue, or a politician really has some conviction. But I wouldn't wait for the third of them.
Thanks, Martin. And Peter has been putting in the chat about this, reinforcing the importance of deepening the democratic process and getting an independent voice for the future, which picks up on the themes he voiced very clearly earlier. So I think we've run out of time for this bit of the session. I think now, Matthew, I know you've sort of responded. Was there anything else that you wanted to sum up before we hand back to Sharon for next steps?
No, I'm very happy. I think with the discussion, Maxine, and where we've reached, is clearly very, very difficult. And we debated a lot in trying to create the sort of checklist frameworks that bring together the issues that we brought together. We debated a lot sort of the inclusion of the ethical parts of the framework, which, as several people said, not that common in a sort of economic framework. We debated a lot the level of granularity to get down to. Should we be talking about discount rates, or should we be staying at the higher level that many people have commented on as being appropriate? And what this tries to do, in essence, is to provide that foundation for, if you're trying to think about some of these long-term decisions that have long-term consequences, what are the issues that you should go through and think through, and in different circumstances the way in which you do that will be different. But having thought through each area systematically, you can have some confidence, hopefully, that that nothing's been left off. And certainly in developing this framework to the next stage, one of the things that I'd be keen to do is engage with people who think things may have been left off, and how do we bring them in.
Thanks, Matthew. Sharon, I think I'm handing back to you for some final comments.
Thanks very much, Maxine, and thank you, Matthew, and thanks all for a really interesting and challenging discussion. I think we all agree that these issues just aren't easy, but there is a real imperative, I think, for us to look at them. Paul has made the point about the decision has been made, the commitment has been made to net zero, but I think there is still a lot to play for to ensure that that commitment is delivered on, and to ensure that we don't just go for net zero. We also have to solve and address multiple challenges, including biodiversity loss and obviously ongoing climate impacts, as well as climate mitigation. So I think some of the points that Peter made at the beginning around the importance of context when you think about these issues are really important. And then the point you made, Maxine, about being honest about how it's difficult, what the costs are, etc., can really help shape how we approach some of these things and deal with the fact that, yes, a lot of this is subjective. We need to relate it to other things in our lives rather than see it just as something independent. So in terms of next steps, what we're going to be doing at Sustainability First is feeding some of the results of this discussion today and the excellent analysis in the framework paper into some of the key policy decisions that are coming up. So people have referred to the net zero strategy we're waiting for. We're also waiting for the BEIS affordability and cost of energy review. We're waiting for the Treasury review of economic regulation. And we have all sorts of price review processes, RIIO2, RIIO3, PR24, chugging away in the background, where some of this needs to start to be put into practice. We need to start implementing the framework and using it to really guide those difficult decisions. So we'll be using that in our work at Sustainability First to do that. And we'll also be using it, hopefully, as a tool that the new Westminster Future Generations Commission can use. However, we strongly believe that to get the change we need at the scale and pace needed, and given the degree of uncertainty that we face, and Bridget made some really sort of very important points about the past not necessarily being a good guide to the future. Although change in policy and regulation is going to be important, we don't think that will be sufficient. We need to see a transformational shift in our decision making to really put intergenerational fairness issues at the heart of it. And for this to happen, as Martin has said, we think that we need a far stronger focus on culture and behaviours. And we think this is really important to support key actors as they make these difficult decisions, and to try and bring together public engagement, leadership, and active decision-making processes. Unless you have that sort of lockstep change, it's very difficult to focus on identifying common interests, uncovering co-benefits, and getting decision-making to work across silos in a very active way. So we need, from our point of view, to shift mindsets and attitudes if we're going to get that shift. And today's discussion about the difficulties around how some of this is subjective and the weight you give to different factors underlines this point. At Sustainability First, we're going to be addressing this through our new Sustainability Principles project, which we've kicked off this summer. And throughout this project, we're going to be developing and testing a set of principles that we think can support the cultural change we need to see, whether that's for policymakers, regulators, business leaders, or civil society leaders. And one of the enabling governance principles we've identified in our strawman framework is around future focus and long-term thinking. Over the next year, we're going to be testing our strawman that we've developed against use cases, and then crucially by engaging civil society groups in this discussion. So this is really picking up Peter Davis's and Bridget's points about the need to deepen citizen engagement and the value of deliberative processes. And Paul's concerns that people aren't yet there in terms of understanding and accepting the changes that they need to introduce into their everyday lifestyles. Many of the people on this call are involved in this work. If you're not and you would like to be or like more information, please do get in touch. You're also very welcome to attend our forthcoming Shake Up the System conference, which is quite significant, which we're holding on the 21st and 22nd of September. It's an online conference, and here we're going to be looking at how to link behavioural, social and systems change. So this is really about how you get that step change, lockstep change that we need to deliver a fair climate future. And Bridget's points about lack of imagination hopefully will be uncovered here, because we want to use very inclusive approaches to how we open up this conversation. And we've been working with artists to help us envision different futures. So to round up, just to say thank you to all our speakers and panelists today for such a really great, stimulating discussion. We haven't got any sort of clear defined outputs or decisions that we've come up with, but I think we have started to progress some of these issues. And a particular thank you to Matthew and Amara and Frontier for their excellent report, which has really, I think, helped to move this discussion forward. We look forward to continuing to work with everyone on the call today in this area to collectively create momentum for better decision making and to support decision makers. I think the phrase you used, Matthew, was the framework being able to provide decision makers with comfort that their decisions are consistent with net zero commitments. So we really hope to be able to use that work in this way, so that we can all really be able to look at our children and grandchildren in the eye and say that we took their interests into account. So thank you very much. We will be putting up the recording online, so if your colleagues would like to catch up with the discussion, please do share it. Have a good afternoon and a good weekend.